This video is for GCSE Business Studies and it's looking at the economy. So it's going to be looking at the different stages of what an economy can go through, but start off with the basics. It's just going to look at the key components of how an economy is actually run. So I'm going to use this diagram here, which is known as the circular flow of income, and it's a diagram that's often used in the initial stages of the subject of economics, especially in terms of looking at how a national and global economy is run. So if we consider just the standard national economy and we think about the key components of that economy, and two of them is households and firms, and they're absolutely crucial in the running of an economy. So if we think about households, they obviously provide the labour force, but they're also consumers as well. And if you think about firms, they hire the labour force, but they also provide goods and services for consumers to consume. Now, when firms hire the labour force, they obviously provide them with an income. Now, the labour force use that income, and then they become consumers, and they buy those goods and services. So we can see money is circulating around the economy, hence why it's called the circular flow of income. The government also play a really significant role, and the government oversee all the transactions within the economy, and they'll just make sure that the economy is run fairly and that nobody's being exploited. So for example, the labour force isn't being exploited, the consumers are not being exploited, firms are not exploiting other firms, and they just make sure that I suppose there's greater equality, or they aim for greater equality within the economy as well. Now, because of the complicated nature of economics and because of the acceleration of globalisation and international trade, sometimes the money that circulates around the economy can kind of slip out of the economy and go towards other economies. So if we think about international trade and we think about the option of buying goods from abroad, this is obviously known as imports. And every time you buy a good or a service from a different country and you're importing from a different country, money is leaving the economy and it's going into another country's economy. And therefore, our income, our national income, would start to fall if there's greater imports. Also, if consumers choose not to use their income for consumption and they decide that they're going to save, then they're stopping the money from circulating around the economy, and this is also known as a withdrawal from the economy. So therefore we require injections for there to be an equilibrium to try and stabilise the circular flow of income. And one way of doing that is obviously trying to attract consumers from other countries in the form of exports. So we also try to sell goods and services to different countries. And that means money will be leaving their economies and coming into our economy. And we also try to attract investment. Now that could be investment from firms domestically, or it could be from firms abroad. If it's foreign direct investment, so one example is when Google invested and set up headquarters in London's King's Cross, then again that is money from other economies coming into our economy. So it starts to create an equilibrium. Sometimes the government feel that they also have to interfere and they have to start to maybe place taxation policy amongst maybe different products. And from doing that, obviously they're pulling money out of the economy. Now, one of the reasons they may do it is because they believe that certain goods need to be taxed to try and discourage the consumption. So, for example, if you think about cigarettes, e-cigarettes at the moment, think about alcohol, think about these goods that may be sometimes quite harmful for the economy, and they have knock-on effects on the society in terms of maybe bad health, maybe antisocial behaviour. And again, the government needs to fund the public sector, they need to fund hospitals, they need to fund the police, and the way they do that is via taxation policy. So if they're taxing, but they're also spending on the economy, so again that hopefully creates an equilibrium. But if the government is taxing more than they're spending, then again there's a disequilibrium because more money is leaving than what's coming in, and vice versa. So the economy can go through different stages, and this is called the economic cycle, so we're going to have a look at that now. So as we can see, from quarter 1 of 2004 all the way to quarter 3 2016, there's been big fluctuations of economic activity within the UK. Now, how this is measured is via GDP. So GDP measures economic growth, and GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, and it measures the value of output of goods and services within an economy. So if there's lots of output and there's a greater value of output, then that suggests higher levels of economic growth. If the value of output starts to fall, then that indicates that there's also a decline in economic activity and a fall in economic growth. Now, the general diagram of the economic cycle is set out just to show students the different phases an economy can go through. So as we can see by the axis, we've got GDP growth, and we've got high levels of GDP growth when we're experiencing a boom. Now, a boom looks really promising. It looks like the economy's booming, everything's going well, it's positive, but it can also have its negative consequences, and we'll look at that soon. If the economy starts to decline, and we see economic growth falling, and we see 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, then we are experiencing a recession. If that recession gets worse and it becomes more prolonged, then we may be experiencing a depression. A depression is obviously really, really bad for the economy, and it's quite rare because usually the government and central banks intervene to try and prevent it. But probably one of the more noticeable examples, especially in Europe, is Greece, where they experienced slump-type conditions within their economy. If the economy maybe goes from a recession and starts to grow again, and there might be signs of a recovery, so we can see that economic growth is starting to grow again, so the economy is starting to get better. So let's have a look at what happens at each stage. So we'll start off with a recession, and the last, it wasn't the last recession, but the one that was most noticeable was in 2008 in the UK, and that was started in the US. And because of how globalised the world is, we are quite vulnerable to our trading partners' economies as well. So when the American economy obviously went into this and hit this recession, then our firms that were in the American market also got impacted, and our economy got impacted as well, as did quite a lot of countries within the world. Now, what might happen during a recession? First of all, you have to remember that confidence will be really poor within the economy. There'll be very low confidence, and confidence is absolutely crucial within an economy. And one of the reasons for that is due to investment. If you think about firms, they're not going to invest into the economy and maybe expand and grow and maybe build more infrastructure if they are not confident that the economy is going to grow. So they're going to kind of reject the chance to invest, which may halt economic growth. Furthermore, consumers will also have fears about the economy, and therefore they may reduce their consumption, and they may spend less because then they're worried perhaps about their job. And again, due to that, companies will also experience lower demand, and therefore profit levels will fall. If profit levels start to fall, then businesses will have to reduce costs in some way, and usually labour is one way they do so, and that's via redundancies. And you can imagine that even causes worse confidence within the economy because people have less job security. Because there's less demand as well, and there's less demand, so what will happen is there'll be also excess supply, and resources will not be being used for production, and therefore what might happen is because of the excess resources, the excess supply, it may start to reduce the price level within the economy. So it may cause deflation. So deflation is when price levels fall, when the average price level falls. Or it might just reduce the level of inflation. And all that means is that prices might still be rising, but at a much slower rate than it did before. So it may have positives, it may have negatives, but even if we think about deflation, often students think, but deflation must be a really good thing because prices are falling. But if you think about it from this point of view, if you know that prices are continuously falling, then are you going to actually consume, or are you going to wait for prices to fall even further? And if so, you are not consuming. If you're not consuming, then think about the economic growth within the economy and how poor that will be. Now the next stage I'm going to look at is a boom, and you could see it's almost the opposite of what might happen during a recession or worse, a depression. But there's going to be higher and greater confidence and better and more positive speculation within the economy. Firms are going to start to invest more. They're going to start to expand and grow, and because of that, they'll probably take on more labour. There'll be higher levels of consumption, so therefore demand will increase, and therefore there is the need for labour to obviously produce on their behalf. The demand, however, may grow faster than the supply, and the producers might struggle to have enough resources to cater for this demand, and this might put pressure on the price level, and we might start to see inflation. And because goods are starting to become more expensive within the economy, it might actually have, cause complications and cause issues with imports and exports. So for number one, other countries may be put off from buying our goods because they may see it as being too expensive and look at alternative countries for cheaper supplies or cheaper goods and services. Domestic and local customers may think actually the local goods are quite expensive at this moment in time because of inflation, and they may decide to buy from elsewhere, and they may decide to import. So again, that's money leaving the country but not coming into the country. So even though a boom is mostly positive, it does have its drawbacks when it has impacts on price. Now I'm going to show you a video, and this video is based on after the 2008 recession, when the economy started to show signs of recovery. And you'll see the link between employment and economic growth.
A growing economy brings an expanding workforce, and that's plain at this high-tech printing business. More companies want to advertise, so they order display artwork from firms like this, and that means more staff are needed. So here they've taken on 9 new employees this year, increasing the workforce by nearly 10%.
My confidence at this moment in time is as high as it's been for the last 5 years. We've seen some sustained activity that has had no drop-off in any areas. And in that respect, both in terms of employment and investment, it's about as good as it's going to get for me.
Good news was the way the Prime Minister described the jobs figures in the Commons today.
There are 250,000 more people in work. Youth unemployment is down, long-term unemployment is down, unemployment amongst women is down.
But the Labour...
So that video gives you an idea of why economic growth is something that the government really want to achieve. Now, to finish off the video, I've just got a bit of a task for you. So what I want you to do is, I want you to pause the video in a couple of seconds, and I want you to look at each scenario and think, would this scenario happen if there was low economic growth or high economic growth? So if you pause the video now. So let's start off with demand for luxury goods, and that relates to something that you may have seen in your textbook called income elasticity of demand. And what that relates to is, if your income goes up and the demand for certain goods also go up, then it's got a positive income elasticity of demand. Now if it's quite highly positive, then that might indicate that these goods are luxury goods. And that would happen if there's high economic growth. Now if I skip one and just go to this one here, the demand for inferior goods, because it relates, again, if it's an inferior good, it means it has a negative income elasticity of demand. So that means if your income goes up, the demand for these goods fall. And vice versa, if your income falls, then the demand for these goods increase. So if demand for inferior goods rise, it suggests that maybe the economy is experiencing a recession. And if you think about the shop Poundland, Poundland was, well, you can tell obviously that they sell goods at a very cheap price, and therefore in the last recession of 08, they actually rapidly expanded because of rising demand. The only consequence of that is when the recovery started, like it showed in that video, then consumers started to switch to the more normal goods, and therefore the demand for Poundland fell, and Poundland found themselves in trouble, especially because of that rapid expansion. Also, if we think about other factors, so if you think about employment rising, we know that would happen when there's high economic growth because of the need for employment because of higher demand for goods and services. What we may find is household debt rising due to increased borrowing. We might find that in a negative economic growth or a low economic growth. And the reason for that is some people might struggle to support themselves and their families and therefore may have to borrow money. Prices falling, we've already mentioned this earlier, that might happen in negative economic growth due to excess supply and excess resources. Prices rise because again, just the opposite of that would be high economic growth because we're putting pressure on current resources and we might not have the supply to meet demand. Now these two are to do with policies, and these policies are to do with the government and to do with central banks. Now, the government might play around with tax depending on the economic growth in the economy. If the economic growth is very, very high and it's causing inflation and prices are rising, the government might not be too happy with that and might want to try and stop this inflation from getting too high. So therefore they may start to increase taxation to withdraw money out of the economy. And again, just to try and reduce consumption and so on. If the economy is not doing very well and we've got low economic growth, then the central bank might decide to reduce interest rates to try and encourage borrowing and discourage saving. And if you borrow and you're not saving, then you're most likely spending. If the government spend more on the economy, then that suggests that there's low economic growth because they're trying to inject money into the economy. If the government are forced, though, to increase welfare payments, again, similar to government spending more on the economy, it might suggest low economic growth, but for different reasons. This reason is because maybe there's more unemployed that require support. Business costs could go up, that relates to the one above it, and that would be high economic growth because prices are rising, and that would include the prices for example, supplies and resources and raw materials and commodities. But it also might mean employees, because they're in such demand, they might have more bargaining power and might ask for higher wages. Investors, if they reduce investment, then that would probably happen because of confidence being low, so that might be due to negative economic growth. And again, if unemployment rises, low or negative economic growth. Consumers lose confidence, same. If consumers have higher disposable income, it suggests that their income has risen or they're in a job, and again, high economic growth. And finally, the government intake from VAT may rise. Well, VAT is an indirect tax based on goods and services, the purchase of goods and services. So if there's more consumption going on, it suggests higher level of economic growth is taking place.